Hello, fellow birders. My name is Dennis Kania. Today we're going to be taking a closer look at bird topography. This is a topic that I always include in my classes that I teach at the Morton Arboretum, and I think you'll find it to be very helpful. On the DuPage Birding Club Education channel, we'll be discussing all things bird-related. And as I mentioned, we'll be looking at bird topography today. So here are some nice illustrations that show just how a bird's feather plumages are all put together to give an overall pattern that we see and call field marks. It's really important to be able to memorize all of these elements and know that terminology. If you do that, eventually you'll have built a template in your mind that helps you to recall all the different things you should be looking for. The more you can train your brain to look for all these things, the more obvious they'll become as you see them. So if we take a close look here at the illustration of the head, you can see starting at the top, we have a median crown stripe, and then moving counterclockwise, we have lateral crown stripe, supercilium, eye ring, eye stripe, mustachial stripe, submustachial area, and malar stripe. You'll hear me using these terms a lot in all the things we'll be discussing in the future, so that's why I thought it would be a good idea to talk about them today. The next illustration down below that, you start out with crown, then going clockwise, we have ear coverts and nape, mantle, scapular, back, rump, undertail coverts, tail, undertail coverts, thigh, belly, flank, breast, throat, chin, lower, and forehead. There's a couple things to take note of here. For one, I think that in this illustration, thigh is probably misidentified. That's really, in my mind, that's an ankle, because the bend of that joint that's right below that, where that arrow points, that's really heel. And when it comes down to looking at these small passerines, there's really not a whole lot of reason to be distinguishing between mantle and scapulars, but it's good to know that they do exist. The last illustration that we have here on the top is starting out showing what the different feather tracks are in the wing, and we start out with lesser coverts, then median coverts, greater coverts, tertials, secondaries, primaries, primary coverts, marginal coverts, and alula. So as I mentioned, if you do train your brain to look for these various features, you're going to actually record a lot more information. And just as an example of that, here's a little challenge that you can take. I'm going to show you an image and then see if you can tell me, after we go back to a blank screen, what was in that image. Now, usually when I do this in class, everybody gets those first digits with no problem. They can easily do that. It's just 4 digits, so that's pretty easy. Then the next example, that's in the form of a phone number. So that's also something that you would easily recognize, and we're easily memorizing or acknowledging what those numbers were. So I keep making this a little harder with each example, and we'll try one more here. So you're not seeing these images for very long, but your brain is able to actually capture that information and save it so that you can regurgitate those numbers back to me. And I'm sure that you got most of those numbers pretty easily. There's a reason for this, and that is we've trained our brain almost all of our lives to recognize numbers and to recognize letters and to recognize colors. And so it all comes second nature to us. But when it comes to something like median crown stripe or supercilium, that's not rolling off of the tip of your tongue just like those numbers and letters do. So you have to train yourself to look for those things. And the more you do that, you create this little checklist or template in your mind that helps you to record all the things that you see, even though you don't really take note of them specifically, but you'll be able to recall them just like you can recall those numbers. Our brain is very, very powerful, and we just need to channel it to capture these things that we're interested in. So here's another illustration, and this one might be helpful in better understanding those feather tracks that exist in the wing. With the wing open, it's much easier to see all the things that are going on. We can see where the Scapulars come in and lay over the edge of the wing. And then the next section of feathers that we have is called the lesser coverts, and that forms this little area right here. And then we have median coverts below those. Those are right here. And below those are greater coverts. So if you think of all these coverts as shingles on a house, one layer is smaller than the one above it or below it. And so it actually is covering more and more and more of the exposed areas. But those exposed areas, as the feathers get smaller, the exposed areas are smaller. So you need smaller feathers to cover them. So we start out with greater coverts here, which are covering large feathers. And then we have median coverts covering the bases of those greater coverts, and then lesser coverts covering the bases of the median coverts. And although this illustration doesn't show it, then we have something along the edge of the wing called marginal coverts. And those will be covering the lesser covered bases. So then we also have alula here, and we have primary coverts, which are covering just the primaries. We have three sets of feathers composing the wing. We have the tertials here. There are always three, on these small passerines here in North America, there are always three tertials, and here they are, 1, 2, 3 tertials. And then we have secondaries, and the secondaries are all the same length. There are 6 of them on our small passerines, and here they are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then there are 9 primaries, starting with the innermost one being primary number 1 and going all the way out to the tip to primary number 9. In the tail, each side of the tail, or each half of the tail, has 6 feathers. And so here we have the center one being number 1, and as we go outward, we get out to number 6. And the same thing is happening on this side as well. So I think it's much easier to recognize all these feather tracks when you see the wing open. And I would like to point out also that we have the exact same thing going on the underside of the wing. So normally we don't see that, especially when the wing is closed. But if we were to see this bird flying from underneath, we'd see that there's also a set of coverts operating in the same fashion on the underside of the wing. So here's, just so you realize that we're not just talking about an artist's rendition of what these things look like. Here in reality is a wing. This is a European warbler. And you can see here are those primaries, here are the secondaries, here are the tertials. Here are our greater coverts, our primary coverts. There happens to be one alula sticking out here. And then we have median coverts, and then lesser coverts up in here. So all those things exist in this open wing, and this is what the wing would look like then when it's folded. We still can see the alula, we can still see the primary coverts, we can still see greater coverts here. We can barely see any of the median coverts, and the lesser coverts are buried up in here from feathers coming off the back. Those would be those scapulars. Here's our tertials, 1, 2, 3. Here's our secondaries stacked up. They're all the same length right there. And then we have our primaries coming out here. So all those things really do exist. If we take a closer look at this American tree sparrow, we can see that some of those characteristics we saw in those illustrations exist. If we look at the head pattern here in particular, we can see there's somewhat of an eye ring going on. It's a broken eye ring because there's an eye line going through it. So here's our eye line. It's not in front of the eye, it's only behind the eye, so we would call that a postocular eye line. Here's the supercilium. There's a hint of a mustachial stripe here, but I don't really see any kind of malar stripe. We have a crown that for the most part is rufous in color, and there is, because this bird's in such fresh plumage, we do have kind of a dusting of gray that appears to be forming a median crown stripe, which this species really doesn't have. So that's just kind of a dusting that's temporary. If we go to the wing, we can see right here are our median coverts just sticking out, just a little bit out from underneath the scapulars. Our lesser coverts would be in here, and they're buried right now. Then you can see that these median coverts have white tips to them. It looks like the centers, from what we can see of it, are very, very dark. If we move on down to the greater coverts, which is this feather track right here, we see that, again, they're all tipped in white. And we can see that the centers of those feathers are black, and the outer edge is rufous. So if you can imagine, this appearance of this bird can change quite a bit depending on how it's holding its feathers and holding its wing. When the wing is in this position, you can see there's a lot of that black being exposed. But if it closes its wing up more, all of the greater coverts could end up looking like these right here. where you don't see any black at all, and you just see the white tips, and you see all that rufous. By the way, because you have all these feathers in a row, this is what is forming a wing bar. And here's our other wing bar. So this bird has 2 wing bars. We have primary coverts here, just barely sticking out. And we can tell that these are all of our primaries. You can see how they are each a little bit longer, each one going further and further out. Our secondaries are right here, once again, all the same length. And then we can see our tertials. Here's number 1, number 2, and number 3. 3 tertials kind of overlaying. So we're seeing quite a few of our feather tracks in this example. The back, we're not able to get too much of the pattern here, but if we were to pull out individual feathers, what we would find is that the centers of those feathers are dark with an outer edge to them that's either buffy or this rufous color. And in this position, I can't really tell you much about this tail. So I mentioned wing bars in that last example, and I wanted to show you something. There can be other things going on in the wing besides wing bars being formed by those median and greater coverts. Because here, right here, we have our greater coverts. And those feathers are actually ending right here where my cursor is. And we have our median coverts here, and you can see those are kind of ending right here. It's a little hard to tell because everything is black. Here's our primary coverts. And they're all ending right where my cursor is. Here's an alula. So we can see all those feather tracks going on, but then there's this big swath of orange. And so what is that coming from? It's not coming from the coverts. It certainly isn't considered a wing bar because a wing bar would be formed by those coverts, and it would be just the tips of all those feathers that would be of one color or another, generally white. At least in our previous example, it was white. So what's happening here is if I were to pull out one of these primaries, I would find out that most of the feather is dark in color, but as I get closer to the base, it turns to orange. And so with all those flight feathers all stacked up, one on top of the other, and here you can kind of see a little spacing in between them, but here it becomes a solid swath of color. All of those are the bases of those feathers. If these greater coverts extended out further, we wouldn't see any of that. Let's say if they came out to here, we'd see just a little bit of orange here and a little bit of orange here. So this color is actually coming off of our primaries and our secondaries. So a different situation completely from what we just saw on that American tree sparrow. Here's another example. We're all familiar with black-throated blue warbler, and everybody always talks about the little white handkerchief. So where is that coming from? Once again, here's our greater coverts, and now this bird isn't all black, so it's easier to see where those greater coverts are ending. Here's our primary coverts. You can see where those are ending, and then all of a sudden there's this little white patch. So once again, it's not coming from any of the coverts, it's actually the base of the primaries that is white. And here we see an example of the bird with its wings open, and you can see just that. Here are our primary coverts right here. I'm drawing a line at the top of those feathers. And then here's our greater coverts here. And here's median coverts. So that white doesn't show up until we get out of the coverts. And it's, as you can see, most of this feather is dark, but then as we get down towards the base of the feather, we get this white patch. So you put all those feathers together in a row, and when the wing is open, you get quite a big white band here. When they're all closed up and stacked up on top of each other, it just becomes this little white patch like that. This is a Henslow sparrow, and the reason I have this illustration in here is showing a couple of things that we haven't talked about yet. We do have a supercilium here, and we have a median crown stripe, or lateral crown stripe, I'm sorry. And then here's the median crown stripe. The median crown stripe is in the center, and you can see that that is distinctive and sticks, it really stands out. The other thing I want to point out here is that we have 2 stripes coming off of the bill. The one that's coming from where the 2 halves of the bill meet or joined together, or right where my cursor is right here, that's going to be your mustachial stripe. If there's another line, and if it's coming off of the bottom, the lowest point on the bill where it meets the face, which is where my cursor is right now, that's a malar stripe. So you'll have birds just like this that could have both of those stripes, but then you can also have birds that might only have a malar stripe, or they might only have a mustachial stripe. And if you're describing that to somebody, you want to be able to get that feature correct. So you want to make sure you know where it's coming from off of the base of the bill. Again, if it's where the 2 parts meet, that's the mustachial stripe. If it's coming off of the lowest point on the bill, then it's a malar stripe. So I think this example makes that pretty clear. So here's an example of a bird we're all familiar with, and I always have this quiz in my Arboretum classes, and I ask people, well, tell me where the red is on the wing of a red-winged blackbird. And for some reason, I don't understand this, but for some reason, 80% of the time people will say the greater coverts. Well, here are the greater coverts, and they don't look red at all. And then here's the median coverts, and they're kind of that buffy orangey color. And then here are the lesser coverts up at the top of the wing. And that's the area that's red. And so this bird is obviously very excited. And so he's flashing those big red patches. He wants to tell somebody, this is my territory, stay away. This bird, on the other hand, is actually covering up its lesser covers with some feathers coming off of the back. Those are the scapulars. So we don't see that big flash of red in this individual. And the point of this is that the birds are in control of those feathers, and they can control the image that you're going to see. So you can't count on every red-winged blackbird having a big patch of red. So mastering bird topography is important for several reasons. By learning and using a common terminology, birders will better be able to communicate their sightings to others. Quite often I get asked by neighbors in my neighborhood here, gee, I saw this bird in the backyard and it had some white in the wing. Well, I can probably name 100 birds that have white in the wing. Or they'll say it had some yellow on the head. Well, I can name 20 birds that have yellow in the head. So, without actually knowing where that yellow is or where that white is, it's very difficult to help another birder to determine what species they were looking at. So if we use this terminology, that helps us to place the colors or the markings in the proper place, and then that helps paint a picture for whoever you're communicating with. Recognizing how feather tracks come to form the field marks that we see and help us understand how birds' appearances can change through behavior and feather wear. That's another important feature. So I gave you some examples of how appearance can change. I didn't talk much or at all about how feather wear can change the appearance of a bird, but once you start to get a feel for what feather tracks are in play and how they do form field marks, that's something that will become apparent to you, and we'll probably talk about that in some future sessions. By using that mental checklist that I talked about of bird topography, then you have the power of your brain working for you to identify information in the field that you can then retain and use for determining what species you had. So all this can be accomplished through repetition and repetition and more repetition. And you might want to watch this video again. So that would be my suggestion to you. Try looking at this over and over again and try really hard to master some of those things I'm talking about. So thanks for taking the time to view this video. Hopefully we've given you some bird food for thought, and I hope you'll join us again in the future as we explore all things bird related.